So I'm going to start with a hypothesis. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about religious symbolism and archetypes. But there's a problem with that, and the problem is it lacks concretization. You know, to think about the ultimate ideal as only something that's symbolic. It moves away from the real world, and it's partly for this reason that there's an insistence in Christianity that the Logos is two things at once. It took me a long time to figure this out, and I was guided in my attempts to understand it by Carl Jung, who was a truly remarkable person, and probably orthodox in his fundamental convictions, I would say. He talked about the Logos as the thing that existed at the beginning of time, and this is a very particular way of looking at things. And so the idea is essentially that, as Jonathan pointed out, that there's something about consciousness that calls forth being from chaotic potential. And you all understand what this means, because when you look at the future, or if you look at yourselves, you know that what you confront is a field of potential, and everyone tells you that. They tell you, you're not living up to your potential. And potential is a very strange thing, because it doesn't yet exist, and so by the canons of, say, modern science, it's not something that has any reality whatsoever, but everyone knows precisely what it means. And everything around you is full of potential, because you can interact with it and bring forth new things. And you know that. And you can be called for your failure to do it. And you call out yourself for your failure to do it, because you wake up at 3 in the morning and you torture yourself with your inability to bring forth the potential that's within you, and it haunts your soul, and it's hellish. And the reason it's hellish is because it is hellish. And if you don't call forth the potential that's within you and outside of you, then the world does transform into hell, because that's its tendency anyways. And we've had no shortage of evidence of that in the last 100 years. It's part of the Christian doctrine that at the beginning of time, the Logos of Yahweh operated on potential and brought forth the habitable world, order. And it was perfect in some strange sense. It was the paradise in which Adam and Eve were placed. And the paradise was a walled garden, a well-watered place. And the walled garden is a place of order and chaos, culture and nature. And that's because people inhabit a garden of culture and nature. That's our environment. And if those two properties are properly balanced, then inside that garden everyone can flourish. And human beings are, in principle, made in the image of that Logos. And that's why we can speak things into being. And we do. And when you speak truth, then you speak paradise into being. And when you speak falsely, you speak hell into being. And that's the truth. And what that means is that with every decision that you make, you decide for yourself and for everyone else whether you're going to tilt the world a little bit more towards hell or a little bit more towards heaven. And that's the burden you bear for your existence and the choices that you make as you pass through life. And it's the fleeing from that that's at the bottom of the nihilism of postmodernism and the escape into the totalitarian certainties of idol worship. And none of this is fictional, because we've seen the consequences. Jonathan said, quoting, I don't remember the source, that there could be no poetry after Auschwitz. But that's wrong. But the poetry has to be about Auschwitz. The lesson from Auschwitz was never again. And fair enough, but you can't decide not to repeat something terrible unless you understand it. And the way to understand it is that the small sins of each individual culminate in the great sins of the state. And so when you ask, why terrible things happen in the world, the answer is quite simple. The answer is it's because you're not good enough. And it's because you don't tell the truth. And you know it. Jonathan said something I thought was very interesting. It's something I've thought about, but I haven't talked to him about it at all. What happens as you move towards the truth? And the answer is everything comes together. That really is the answer, is everything comes together. There's even a sexual element to that, because of course the highest element of sexual ecstasy is to come together. And around someone who's telling the truth, everything comes together, and that's the potential destiny of the world. It's something that you can partake in. It's the call to the greatest adventure that there is. You can bring forth something akin to paradise by speaking the truth, and you can start in your own life, and you can start in the life of your own families, and these are people in principle that you love, and so why would you do anything but speak the truth to them? To protect them from reality? There's no protecting anyone from reality. Reality just is. You interact with it on its terms, and you do that by facing it forthrightly. And you do that by not shying away from the challenge. I spent a lot of time trying to understand the Sermon on the Mount. It's a very strange document. I'm going to tell you what I think it means. It means conceptualize the highest good that you can. And so you might think that would be the highest good for you, and it would be the highest good for the family around you that you love, and it would be the highest good for that family in the state, and it would be the highest good for the state in the world. And that would be the highest possible good. Aim at that, even though you don't know how. Aim at that. Make that what you want. And then tell the truth. And it's an adventure because you don't know what's going to happen. You have no idea, because if you treat things instrumentally, if you treat people instrumentally, you use them as tools for your own desire. And the problem with that is, what do you know about what you desire? Many things that you chase will turn out to be empty. Well, what happens if you just tell the truth? Well, the world will unfold around you in very strange and mysterious ways, and there isn't anything that's more exciting than that, and it's perhaps something exciting enough so that the suffering that's attendant on being would redeem itself by that adventure. And that's the call. That's the Western call to the individual. The suffering of being can redeem itself through truth. And it's not a rule. It's not a proposition that you need to adhere to like a good citizen. It's the proper way of wending your way through the terrible world without making it worse than it already is, and with the possibility perhaps of making it better. There's no more exciting possibility than that, and no higher moral demand. And the thing is everyone knows it. You know when you lie according to your own conception of the truth, that there's something shameful and demeaning about that, and you know that it hurts people. And you think, well, why do you do it? Despite all that, and partly you do it because it's easy. And partly you do it because there's a crooked, horrible, hellish part of your soul that's more than happy if part of what you do is make everything worse to pay for the sin of its existence. And I would say we should stop doing that and see what we could do if we got ourselves together. Because human beings are remarkable creatures. We put together an amazing civilization working at it half-time. You know, it's like 55% of humanity on a good day is working to make things better, and 45% is working to make it worse. And you wonder what would happen if we all just decided that we were going to make things better. As simple as that. Start where you are. Make things around you better. Where would we be? What would the world turn into around a civilization of people who were genuinely trying to make things better? I can tell you we better find out soon, because if we don't try collectively to make things better, given the current state of affairs, they are going to get a lot worse. I thought for a long time, I wondered why people find themselves adrift in meaninglessness, and there's a lot of answers to that. There's the classical criticisms of traditional faith that have been put forth by brilliant people like Friedrich Nietzsche. There's the idea that There were fairy tales that people lived by prior to the modern age, and we've outgrown those, and that's left us in a cosmos that's bereft of meaning. And so it's a consequence of the inevitable unfolding of a kind of cutting rationality. And some of that's true, but there's a lot of it that isn't true, you know. Because I've also come to understand that the reason that so many of us proclaim that life is meaningless is because we actually would rather have it be meaningless than to take responsibility for it. Because you can imagine this scenario. Imagine you were offered a choice, and this is because you are offered this choice. You could say, well, absolutely nothing you do matters, and who the hell's going to know anyways in a million years? And so you can do whatever you want moment to moment, right? That's the payoff for that perspective, is you can do whatever you want moment to moment, and you'll not be held responsible by anyone, including yourself, for pursuing your petty, impulsive, immoral, foolish, destructive, genocidal tendencies. Or the alternative is that you can assume that everything you do is meaningful and everything you do has an impact on the way the world unfolds, and take responsibility for that, and it's something that you'll have your meaning all right, that's for sure, because you have an infinite amount of responsibility for every mistake that you make under those circumstances. And perhaps as a medicament for that, the knowledge that when you're on the path properly, that you're helping the world unfold in the best direction that it possibly could. Well, there isn't anything better than that. If you want something to set against the inevitable suffering of life, that's what you set against it. The endless adventure of trying to make things better in every possible way. And God only knows where we could get if we did that. Around the perfect man, everything comes together. And I don't believe that that's where the infinite logos that stretches across time and space comes together in a single individual. That's the Christian story. And the reason for that is that every single person is embedded in a specific time and place. That's you as an individual, but at the same point, you're also the embodiment of this thing that has acted across forever to call chaos into habitable being. You're both this divine, eternal, transcendent essence and the finite shell that you inhabit. It's like the genie, right? A genie is genius, and the genie is something that can grant 3 magical wishes but has to inhabit this tiny little space. It's the same idea. Well, you can act that out in your life, and you can transcend it. And as you do that, things come together around you, and everything becomes musical. That's the right way to think about it. And everything becomes alive. And you shy away from that because you're resentful about the fundamental structure of being, and you don't want the responsibility. And it's no bloody wonder, because the responsibility is the responsibility for everything. You know, that's why it's part of the Christian story that Christ took the sins of the world upon himself. Because that's what you have to do in order to put yourself together. It's your fault. Everything that isn't going right is because you're not good enough. Well, who wants that? Right? Welcome the postmodernists, because they'll lighten the burden. The consequence is that nothing has any meaning, but that's a small price to pay to get rid of that particular burden. Well, maybe not. Maybe the meaning of life is to be found in your voluntary willingness to take on that burden and carry it, right? Well, that's the notion that's embedded in the idea of the cross, right? To pick up a full conscious knowledge of your own vulnerability, your subjugation to betrayal, your slavery at the hands of the state, your insanity and your mortality, and to say, I'll bear that voluntarily. It's okay. I can handle it. It seems to me that we're at a kind of crossroads. I don't know exactly why. You always meet the devil at the crossroads, by the way. And the reason for that is because every crossroads is a choice, right? And it's always a choice between good and evil. We're at a crossroads, and I don't know why. I guess it's because the terrible 20th century has spent its energy and now we have something new in the aftermath of that. It's time for everyone to pick up the chaotic pieces and to carry them voluntarily and to make their way through the world and to try to speak their truth and to see what happens. It will heal yourself. It will heal your body. It will heal your soul. It will heal your family. It will heal the nation. That's what truth does. And how could it be any other way? The reality is the truth. And how are you going to adapt to it without using the truth? Well, the problem is reality is the terrible truth, but it's certainly possible that the terrible truth is its own medicine. With regards to my connection to orthodoxy, I have kind of a funny story to tell about that. About 15 years ago, a student of mine who I've maintained a relationship with since I taught at Harvard, I'd helped him through a difficult period. His family had been at the center of a real storm of publicity like this. A front page story for a number of months. Recently he returned the favor with me. But he proposed at one point that I fly down to Los Angeles and act as the officiant at his marriage. And I thought, well, that's pretty interesting. I never expected that to happen. And so I thought, well, if I'm going to do that, I better get ordained, because that's obviously the logical thing to do. And I thought, well, how do you get ordained on short notice? And obviously the answer to that is you go online. And so, so I went online and I signed up. I could name my church. So I did. I have this church. I'm the only member. It's called the Church of the Spirit of St. Joachim of Flores, which, isn't necessarily the name that you would expect. I liked St. Joachim from what I knew of him because he had this idea that there were three epochs. There would be three epochs in Western civilization, and one would be the epoch of the Father, and that's roughly the Old Testament epoch, and Old Testament morality that has to do with following rules. And then there was the epoch of the Son, and that was, of course, the Christian epoch of the last 2,000 years. And he believed that what would come after that would be the epoch of the Holy Ghost. And the Holy Ghost is this weird spirit thing that hypothetically Christ left behind that could inhabit people and guide them on their path. And it seems to me that that's very much in keeping with the Orthodox idea that the proper moral pathway for each individual to take is to attempt to bear the burden of the perfect individual, right? To become Christ, so to speak, in an attempt to transcend mortality and finitude and to unite with God. And I thought, well, that was kind of a cool idea. So I thought, well, I might as well have that as a church. And then I thought, who should I be in this church? And I thought, well, Pope was probably a little bit on the narcissistic side, let's say. So I thought, I'll be Metropolitan. Because I thought that was kind of archaic enough and sort of out of the way enough so that it was a good joke. So I'm my own Metropolitan, my own church. It only has one rule, and so you can join it if you want. The rule is that if you're a member of my church, you can't follow stupid rules. Yeah, so that's a good rule, because it's an anti-rule, which is really funny as far as I'm concerned. Anyways, I went down to LA and I did marry these two, and they're still married, and so that's good. And yeah, so I know that's a bit rambly, but it's been a long day. I talked to Sam Harris today again, for those of you who, it went great. Yeah, it went great. Anyway, so look, the idea is pretty straightforward, as far as I can tell. There's this tremendous idea that's at the bottom of Western culture that's taken the human race millennia and perhaps an endless amount of time before then, an eternal amount of time before then to formulate. And the idea is that our consciousness, and that's the center of us, the soul, whatever that happens to be, partakes in the process by which creation comes into being. And we do that through the Logos, which is our capacity to think and to utter words and to engage in dialogue, but more importantly to do that truthfully. And that to the degree that we're able to do that truthfully, we bring paradise into being rather than hell. And it seems to me that that's as close to objective reality, although it's not precisely objective. It's more than objective reality. It's a kind of meta-reality. It's It's the most profound truth that you'll ever encounter. And the thing that's cool about it is you can put it to the test if you want. You know, you start deciding that you're not going to lie, because how the hell are you going to tell the truth? What do you know? You don't know what the truth is, but you certainly know when you're lying, and you know how to stop doing that. And so I would say, well, just stop lying and see what happens. Try it for like a year. You don't get to lie about anything anymore. And that also means you can't do things that you would be afraid to talk about, because, you know, if you're going to tell the truth, you have to tell the truth about what you did, and if you do reprehensible things, then you can't just run around telling everybody about them. So it also means that you have to not act in a way that you wouldn't speak truthfully about, and just try it. You'll find out, first of all, that you're so full of lies and deceit that you just bloody well can't believe it. When I started doing this 30 years ago, it really just about drove me crazy, because I divided into two people in some sense, and one person was talking, and the other person was watching the person that was talking, and the talking person was a puppet, and the watching person was the right person, and every time the talking person said something, the watching person would go, "You don't believe that, that isn't true, that isn't your idea." And I thought, wow, that's really not good, because it looks like 95% of what I'm saying isn't mine, or I'm saying it for show, or I'm saying it to be dominant primate, or I'm saying it so that I can be, you know, so that I can use my language instrumentally and get what I want, or you know, I swiped it from a book and I really don't deserve it, but I'm saying it, and like, it was horrible. It was 95%, seriously. And so then I learned, at least in part, to only say things that made me feel like I was together, and that's part of that coming together. You can feel that physically, you know, if you say something deceitful, you shrink and you cower from it. It makes you embarrassed, and it makes you weak. You can feel the weakness. It's like, well, stop saying things that make you weak if you don't want to be weak. Then if you want to be strong, stop saying things that make you feel weak. Try it. Try it. See what happens. You can test this out. In a year, things will be way different for you. In 5 years, you won't even be the same person. And God only knows what will happen in a decade. So it's really worth it. Besides, you don't have anything better to do anyways, because here you are, you know, suffering stupidly away. You might as well do something useful with your time while you're waiting to die. So... And there isn't anything more interesting to do than that. It's so cool, because, and I mean, it's part of what I decided to do last September when I made these, you know, crazy videos, which really had more of an effect than I certainly thought they would. I thought, well, I've got some things to say, and why don't I say them and see what happens? It's like, that's an excellent way to live. Why don't I say the things that I think and see what happens? Well, this is one of the things that's happened, so that's kind of cool. I mean, how unlikely is this? It's completely absurd and ridiculous that here I'm with Jonathan, this crazy French-Canadian carver, and these two guys in dresses here. I mean, that's exactly what you'd expect, given what I've been talking about recently. This is very unlikely, and all of this has been very unlikely. And life is very unlikely, and you know, maybe it could be absolutely magnificent and wonderful. We could make everything into a holy temple in which we could live forever peacefully, only searching for more remarkable and spectacular things to do next. And that's what people do in paradise. They sit around dreaming about how the paradise they already had could give rise to a paradise that's yet greater than the one that's there. And with the collective imagination that we pursue, that could be a never-ending thing, and we could bring it into being, and that's what we should do, because the alternative is to let everything degenerate into chaos and hell. And how about we don't do that? Well, that's good enough. I don't know if it's at the core precisely of the postmodernist's view. I think it's at the core of the problem that every human being has with manifesting sufficient faith to engage fully in life. I mean, we look at our lives and the lives of others, and we see that the one certainty is suffering and loss. And we're, at least in principle, the only creatures that are aware of that. That's really the story in Genesis of Adam and Eve, right? Because Adam and Eve wake up and become aware of their own nakedness, their finitude, their mortality, and that throws them out of the paradise of being, and that's precisely right. That's the situation we all find ourselves in. The fundamental question is all that without ultimate meaning, and it's a very profound question. The answer seems to be something like it's without meaning unless you take it on voluntarily. And I certainly don't understand the full implications of that answer, although I know that insofar as you can test that as a theory in your own life, it seems extraordinarily robust. To the degree that it's a postmodern issue, I think that the postmodernists feed us very thin gruel, because they offer nothing in the face of that suffering except the collapse of everything into the sand that Jonathan spoke of. So that's the best I can do with that. Well, I would say it's cyclical at every moment in some sense. It's nested patterns of cyclicality. I think you can hear that best in the best representation I've ever seen of that is in Bach's Brandenburg concertos. They're really worth a listen. The new videos I'm going to release that I'm doing with interviews use Bach's third Brandenburg concerto, which is an absolutely phenomenal piece of music because it cycles and climbs continually and stays in the same place. I have no idea how he managed it. It's absolutely overwhelming. And that's what history is like. The apocalypse is always on us, right? I mean, you all confront an apocalyptic destiny because you're all going to die. And everything comes to an end, and everything is continually regenerated. And so that cyclicality is built into every moment. That's the U-shaped journey that Northrop Frye talked about too, which is order, the descent into chaos, and the reestablishment of order. And everyone knows what that means in their own life. You're somewhere stable where you understand everything and things are going well for you, and then the rug is pulled out from underneath your feet, and you don't know where you are. You fall into chaos. Someone close to you dies, or you don't get the promotion you were looking for, or some dream collapses on you, or you discover a new fault that you were never aware of before, and you fall into this chaotic state. And in that chaotic state, that's the underworld of mythology, and one of the suburbs of the underworld, the most horrific suburb of the underworld is hell, because when you go into the underworld in chaos, it's easy to become desperate and then angry and then vengeful and then murderous. And that happens to people with a tremendous frequency. If you haven't observed that in your own life, you haven't watched your own interior landscape with any degree of accuracy. And so that cyclicality is built into everything. And it's the structure of being. That's the right way to think about it. And now I think the optimistic part of that is that there is a spiral upward, as far as I can tell, or at least there can be. And you get some sense of that when you participate in your own life, in the sense that you've found a good direction, and that's imbuing you with a sense of positive meaning. And I don't regard positive meaning as an epiphenomenal manifestation of a deeper material reality. I don't believe that's true at all. I believe that there is nothing more real than that sense of engaged meaning. I think your nervous system is actually evolved to tell you when you're in the right place at the right time. It's something that informs you that's literally beyond your senses, but it's absolutely central to proper being. You can tell when you're engaged with the world properly, because all of a sudden the world becomes worthwhile around you. And that's not an illusion. We've been taught for so long that meaning is some sort of illusion or an epiphenomena. I think it's absolutely central. And certainly no one ever thinks that suffering is an epiphenomena. Everyone acts as if their own suffering is the most real thing there is. And no wonder. So if you experience something that enables you to transcend that suffering or to justify it in your own life, which is that sense of meaningful engagement, why wouldn't you regard that as even more real than pain? The only thing more real than pain is that which can transcend it. And you can experience that in your own life. You do that all the time when you're in the right place at the right time. It's a real thing. And I also think that's the place that truth puts you. Well, now how that relates to the cyclicality. Well, that's the pathway out of it, you know. That life is order, chaos, reestablishment of order. And you could say, well, you're the order. Or you could say, you're the chaos. And lots of people are the chaos. Or maybe you're even a denizen of hell inside that chaos. Or you're the reestablished order. And all of those things are reasonable things to be, but the most reasonable thing to be is the thing that constantly moves along that pathway, ever upwards, like that staircase at the back, which is what that represents. It's that spiral upwards, that leads us up into the beyond. That's the stairway to heaven. That's cyclicality. And it's a genuine thing. And you know it, but you don't know you know it. And some of these stories, the icons that Jonathan produces and these stories that we've been talking about are humanity's attempts to make that pattern articulate. And all we've really managed so far is to capture it in image and story. We haven't been able to make it fully articulate, but the time for that, I would say, is approaching, because we need to understand these things consciously so that we can participate in them properly. So. Well, the problem with answering that for me is that I'm by no means an expert on Orthodox theology. So, but from what I understand of it, I would say Jung believed that Jung was a student of Nietzsche. It's something that isn't well known about Jung, because most of the history of psychoanalytic thought was written by the Freudians, and they think of Jung as a student of Freud, and of course that's true. Jung was really introduced to the idea, a profound idea of the unconscious through Freud, and also, at least in part, to the idea that there was an interior world of symbols. But at the same time, Jung was a student of Nietzsche, and you see, Nietzsche announced the death of God in the late 1900s, and what he meant by that, in some sense, was that he meant that the spirit of truth that had been instantiated by Christianity had turned against the dogma of Christianity and destroyed it. And what he meant by that was that the emergence of science in the context of Western culture and the elaborate description of physical reality that was developed as a consequence ended up in apparent contradiction with the truths of our religious tradition, and we picked the most developed truth and let the other one go. And Nietzsche was not celebrating that, contrary to what most people think. I mean, when he spoke of the death of God, he said that it was an absolute catastrophe and that we would pay for it with millions of lives. And that was his prognostication for the 20th century, which happened to come true in precisely the manner he indicated for exactly the reasons. Nietzsche believed that we would have to invent our own values because the old values that we had lived by had bled themselves out and died. But the problem with that, and this is something Jung picked up on, the problem with that is that you can't invent your own values. And you know that because all of you have tried on New Year's Day to decide that you're going to eat less and go to the gym. And you'd think if you could create your own values, being this sort of demigod, that as soon as you told yourself that you would eat properly and go to the gym, you'd be up at 6 in the morning, eating carrots and rutabagas and then going off to lift heavy weights. And of course you're not. You're sitting in your chair at night eating Cheetos and watching pornography, So how in the world is something like that supposed to create its own values? You're not in control of yourself to that degree. And so Jung's answer to that problem was essentially to look partly within and partly to look in the symbolic domain. And what he realized as a consequence of doing that was that there was a profound answer to the question of the resurrection of value. And for him, that was really the embodiment of the pattern of Christ. That was the self as far as Jung was concerned. There's no difference between the archetypal self and the symbolic Christ. They were the same thing as far as Jung was concerned, insofar as Christ is the vision of the perfect man, right? Which is a symbolic vision. So you could say, well, what is Christ? And the answer to that is, well, Christ is whatever you think of as the perfect man. Now, you're going to have diverse representations of that, so you could think about it, Christ as the totality of the visions of the perfect man. It's something like that. And then that the goal of life was to embody that as deeply as possible. And Jung also believed that the world would transform itself around
you to the degree that you did that, to an unspecifiable degree. And that's where the symbolic reality and the historical reality unite. You know, and we know it's true. We also know this is true. If you look at people like Gandhi, or you look at people like Solzhenitsyn, for example, these are great people who stood up as moral icons, let's say, in the midst of absolute chaos, and they transformed entire civilizations by doing that, by standing up for what they believed to be true. They transformed the entire world around them. And of course, they're only partially perfect, someone like Solzhenitsyn or someone like Gandhi or perhaps someone like Nelson Mandela. They're only partial incarnations of perfection, but even to the degree that they were flawed, you know, they were perfect enough so that despite their remnant flaws, they were able to reorganize being itself around them. And we don't know what the ultimate limit of that is. We really don't. It could be that everything will align itself around people to the degree that they put themselves together. And I've had experiences that make me convinced that that's the case. I truly believe that that's the case. So, and that's also what gives me some belief in these strange Christian ideas about the harrowing of hell and the overcoming of death. It's like we have no idea what we could do as individual embodiments of the Logos, which is clearly what we are, because we're all conscious. We have no idea what obstacles we could overcome and what massive transformations we could undertake if we actually lived our lives properly. God only knows what we could get rid of. We could get rid of malaria. We could get rid of schistosomiasis and the guinea worm. Those are going to be gone soon anyways. Polio. We're going to get rid of hunger. Maybe we can get rid of death. Maybe we can get rid of hell. Who knows? And I know I'm certainly someone who believes that hell is real, because I've read enough of the accounts of what happened in the 20th century to know precisely that it's as real as the most warped imagination can possibly make it, and that's plenty real enough for me. So I would say Jung's vision is very much in keeping, as far as I can understand, with the central traditions of the Orthodox Church, because he believed that it was the highest moral duty of the awake soul to participate in manifestation of the self. That's this union of things that Jonathan talked about, that's beyond duality. It's to bring everything in you together into this kind of harmony that then extends beyond you into your family and past that. It's musical. That's what music represents. That's why we find it so intensely meaningful. That's what music tells us. It's an artwork based upon the meaning of pattern, and it infuses everyone. You know what it's like to listen to music. Even the darkest punk-rocking anarchist atheist is overwhelmed with the glory of God when he listens to his punk rock music. So, yeah. So, one of the things that really affected Jung, who by the way, worked for the American government and the CIA during World War II, sending them psychological reports on Hitler. Jung meditated for a very long period of time on what happened in Nazi Germany. And the dictum that he derived from his alchemical studies was inster qualinus invenitur, which I'm probably saying wrong, but it means the thing you want most will be found the place you least want to look. And so for Jung, because one of the questions you might ask yourself is that if enlightenment is possible, let's say, if union with the self is possible, or some sort of mystical transcendence, why in the world aren't we just all that way? What's the barrier? It's like, well, we could be way better. Well, why not just do it then, if it's just right there ahead of us? But the answer to that is something like, you cannot conceive of how good a human being might be until you can conceive of how evil a human being can and will be. And that means to encounter in yourself the Nazi, the prison guard, the Auschwitz guard, to understand fully that there is no difference between you and the people who were killing children in the Nazi death camps. That's you. And that's that encounter with hell. That's literally that encounter with hell. You're a denizen of hell insofar as you're capable of that, and you are capable of that. And there isn't anything, I think, that can scare you straight except that knowledge. You can be and are a vessel that can be used for absolute evil, and you would participate in it. You would participate in it. And so for Jung, the pathway to It's like Dante. You don't get to paradise before you go to the lowest levels of hell, right at the bottom where betrayal lurks. For Dante, that was the worst of all sins. And so it's a terrifying process. I try to teach my students in my Maps of Meaning class, which is the opposite of a safe space as far as I'm concerned. And I mean that technically. I truly do mean that. I try to convince my students, I try to get them to meditate on the fact that they're the damn Nazis. Really? Because what is it? What is it, the Germans? Like, come on, really? No, obviously not. It's people. And so the pathway to paradise is through hell. And it's no wonder no one goes there. I mean, who wants to go there? No one. Well, if you don't go there voluntarily, you'll go there accidentally. So it's better to go there voluntarily, because then you can go with hope. You can say, I can withstand this. Maybe I can find a light at the end of the tunnel. So in the mythological world, I would say, there are three continually intertwined causal elements. One is consciousness. You could say that's the logos. One is the interpretive structure within which that logos exists, and that's the framework that you use to organize yourself cognitively within the world, your point of view. And then there's the world itself, the natural world, let's say. Those three things are always in interplay, and they're each given causal primacy. You see this echoed in popular culture motifs, and I think Pinocchio is a very good example of that, where Pinocchio has a father, and that's Geppetto, who's his creator, and he's a puppet, so a very deterministic sort of creature, and he has a mother, and that's the blue fairy that comes down from heaven, who's really a figure of the vitality of nature. And so Pinocchio is portrayed in the movie as child of nature and culture, which is, of course, how we're portrayed scientifically. But there's a third element in that movie, which is really what drives the plot forward, which is Pinocchio's capacity to make choices. And that's his consciousness, and that's also what elevates him above the status of deterministic puppet. Now, you might say, well, there's no evidence that we're not deterministic, and I could say, well, that's fine, because there's also no evidence that we are deterministic, so we can leave that as a draw. But we certainly treat each other as if we have free will. We treat ourselves as if we have free will. Even those of us who regard each other as deterministic believe that, or as determined, believe that in their own actions they're going to be perfectly irritated at whatever choices you make that happen to infringe upon them, and they're going to act towards you as if you're an agent with free will. So they can say they regard people as deterministic, but they don't act it out, so I don't believe that they believe it. And I also don't believe that you can produce a functional society without having something like that at its basis, and I've never seen any evidence of a functional society being produced without that as a metaphysical presupposition. So, but there's something more crucial involved here too, is that in order to accept the inevitability of determinism in human action, you have to accept the presupposition that consciousness is nothing but an epiphenomena of a deeper material reality. And first of all, we do not know that. We certainly do not know that. What we know about consciousness scientifically, you could put in a thimble and still have enough room for another thimble. We know nothing about it. It's a mystery we have not cracked at all. And people have been beetling away pretty hard on it from a scientific perspective for the last 40 years since it's become in vogue again, and I don't think we've moved forward a little bit. And then finally, so it's a mystery, and I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever that it isn't. I read Dan Dennett's book on explaining consciousness, and it does nothing of the sort. It explains it away, and that's that, and many critics have made the same comment. But I also think that, phenomenologically speaking, it is the case that we seem to encounter the world as a field of possibility from which we extract out choices. You know, you think, well, when I talk to you about your future, I mean, you know what your future is. It's a branching set of pathways, which you can envision, because you can envision the future. It's one of the very strange things about being human. It's a branching set of pathways, of possibilities, and you can pick from among them. And I do believe that's what you're doing. I do believe that the world is a well of possibility and potential, and that you interact with it by choice and transform it within your limited power into what you want it to be. And I don't think there's any evidence to the contrary. And besides, determinism is a scientific philosophy that probably lost its vogue in about 1850. So, you know, there's just no reason to, from a scientific perspective, to describe human beings as deterministic creatures. There's no evidence for it. So we're partly determined, obviously, because there's lots of things we can't do. But that does not, by any stretch of the imagination, mean we're fully determined. So
the logos of Yahweh operated on potential and brought forth the habitable world, order, and it was perfect. In some strange sense, it was the paradise in which Adam and Eve were placed, and the paradise was a walled garden, a well-watered place. And the walled garden is a place of order and chaos, culture and nature, and that's because people inhabit a garden of culture and nature. That's our environment, and if those two properties are properly balanced, then inside that garden everyone can flourish. And human beings are in principle made in the image of that logos. And that's why we can speak things into being. And we do. And when you speak truth, then you speak paradise into being, and when you speak falsely, you speak hell into being. And that's the truth. And what that means is that with every decision that you make, you decide for yourself and for everyone else whether you're going to tilt the world a little bit more towards hell or a little bit more towards heaven. And that's the burden you bear for your existence from chaotic potential. And you all understand what this means, because when you look at the future, or if you look at yourselves, you know that what you confront is a field of potential, and everyone tells you that. They tell you, you're not living up to your potential. And potential is a very strange thing, because it doesn't yet exist, and so by the canons of, say, modern science, it's not something that has any reality whatsoever, but everyone knows precisely what it means. And everything around you is full of potential, because you can interact with it and bring forth new things. And you know that. And you can be called for your failure to do it. And you call out yourself for your failure to do it, because you wake up at 3 in the morning and you torture yourself with your inability to bring forth the potential that's within you, and it haunts your soul, and it's hellish. And the reason it's hellish is because it is hellish. And if you don't call forth the potential that's within you and outside of you, then the world does transform into hell, because that's its tendency anyways. And we've had no shortage of evidence of that in the last 100 years. It's part of the Christian doctrine that at the beginning of time, and the choices that you make as you pass through life, and it's the fleeing from that that's at the bottom of the nihilism of postmodernism and the escape into the totalitarian certainties of idol worship. And none of this is fictional, because we've seen the consequences. Jonathan said, quoting, I don't remember the source, that there could be no poetry after Auschwitz. But that's wrong. But the poetry has to be about Auschwitz. The lesson from Auschwitz was never again. And fair enough, but you can't decide not to repeat something terrible unless you understand it. And the way to understand it is that the small sins of each individual culminate in the great sins of the state. And so when you ask why terrible things happen in the world, the answer is quite simple. The answer is it's because you're not good enough. And it's because you don't tell the truth. And you know it. Jonathan said something I thought was very interesting. It's something I've thought about, but I haven't talked to him about it at all. What happens as you move towards the truth? And the answer is everything comes together. That really is the answer, is everything comes together. there's even a sexual element to that, because of course the highest element of sexual ecstasy is to come together. And around someone who's telling the truth, everything comes together, and that's the potential destiny of the world. It's something that you can partake in. It's the call to the greatest adventure that there is. You can bring forth something akin to paradise by speaking the truth, and you can start in your own life, and you can start in the life of your own families, and these are people in principle that you love, and so why would you do anything but speak the truth to them? To protect them from reality? There's no protecting anyone from reality. Reality just is. You interact with it on its terms. So I'm going to start with a hypothesis. And I spent a lot of time thinking about religious symbolism and archetypes. But there's a problem with that, and the problem is it lacks concretization. You know, to think about the ultimate ideal as only something that's symbolic. It moves away from the real world, and it's partly for this reason that there's an insistence in Christianity that the Logos is two things at once. It took me a long time to figure this out, and I was guided in my attempts to understand it by Carl Jung, who was a truly remarkable person, and probably orthodox in his fundamental convictions, I would say. He talked about the Logos as the thing that existed at the beginning of time, and this is a very particular way of looking at things, and so the idea is essentially that, as Jonathan pointed out, that there's something about consciousness that calls forth being from